sure Lou will. We're just gonna. We're trying to figure out where we'll have a lot of fun. You'll come up on camera. Yeah, right before I can zoom in. And then, great, yeah.
I can put my chair, and then I can.
Simon.
Yes.
We haven't met yet.
Yes. What's your
Sophie.
Sophie.
We're Sophie Rose amongst this family.
Amanda. Joey.
Partner.
Nice to meet you. Thank you. So do you guys live, how do you know?
I'm Emily and David's cousin.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, wow.
Yeah.
The last time I saw her, she was 1 foot tall and she weighed 7 pounds.
So who are your parents?
Blair Goodman and
But that was when you were 12.
Yeah.
The measurements I gave. You were so like for, and now you're totally
A year old?
Yeah. I was like put on
74. 46.
46.
Yeah, I just reversed.
No, he was. I'm 5'4".
Wow, you haven't seen him since he was
No, so I guess.
it's Howard to me.
Wow.
That's great. I'm
Oh my
usually
gosh.
shortest.
After, I'm in California.
Uh-huh.
I want you.
Yeah.
I want you to come.
Would love that. Absolutely. Yeah.
So Blair is Bennett's first cousin.
Okay, gotcha. And do you guys live locally?
Yeah, we live in Rosendale.
I feel like I've seen you.
Yeah, we come over a lot. I feel like one
Like, if I
time.
see, do you go to Cole High? To Cole High?
No.
I don't know, you just look so familiar.
Always at their house.
Oh, I've seen you at Emily.
Yeah, I think so once.
Okay, got
There
it.
was a crossover. We also were at the search party, so maybe
Oh, then I definitely saw
that
you.
was probably. When we were living in Korea.
Why is it called a party?
So that's such a good question.
Party just means a gathering.
Yeah, like in this context.
It's been a long time. Oh.
Yeah, you did. But anymore. Yeah, I wouldn't. I think that's just like how they want to do it. Don't you think it's a little pretty that there's like sunlight coming out from the ceiling? So I think whoever built this thought that was going to be very pretty. And light is often associated
Look at this little lovebird. You just tweak your nose.
So maybe it's
Works
like
great.
emblematic.
Oh, is my hand cold?
that
Let me
God
make
is
it cold then, but you know.
That's
Okay,
why.
you want panels, you want panels.
What's what? This? That's an organ. They're often found in churches. It's a different type of piano. I think that's my best.
As we arrive, I invite you to make sure your devices are off.
Don't forget your phone.
I don't think Bennett would have wanted us to start even this late, even though it's 6 after the hour. I know it's still unfamiliar to be gathering in spaces like this. I invite you to, even if your body is here, continue to arrive. You've learned all of the words to this song already, so just join even quietly to warm our hearts, warm the space, and deepen our arrival. Good morning, I'm Rabbi Shear. I was asked by David and Emily to be the Misader, be the convener of this space. But in truth, I actually knew Bennett longer than I knew Emily or any of the family, and it was because I knew Bennett as a convener of community, as the executive director of Eliyah, who brought me here, brought all of us here. And it's really important to be doing this mourning and this remembering in community, which is still a fraught thing to do. So I applaud your courage for showing up in this space at this time. And I just want to dispatch one technical piece about gathering again. Shiva will be held at David's house later on today. If you plan to go to that house, please rapid test, or as David said, we trust you if you've had it recently, but if you have any questions about what it means to gather, with the tachlis, with the those details out of the way, we don't want to kill the vibe of what it is to be here to remember Bennett, Ben, and Zadie. Rabbi Jonathan Kliegler, who knew Bennett, was held up by weather. And so I actually want to call up Ellen Jehoda, Rabbi Jonathan's partner, to offer some words of elevation.
So, imagine Jonathan while you're looking at me. From Jonathan. I join you all in sharing my sorrow that Bennett is no longer with us, and I'm honored to have been invited to participate in honoring his memory, and I am honored to join the chain. This is Jonathan. I don't recall precisely when Bennett came to Woodstock and joined the Woodstock Jewish congregation, but it was many years ago. Andy, David, and Emily were already pretty grown up, but Lizzy was a little kid and joined our religious school. Bennett became very active in the congregation. This meant, of course, that Bennett offered his ever-flowing fountain, or perhaps I should say gusher, of creativity and goofiness to our community. And I want to say emphatically that the Woodstock Jewish congregation was the better because of Bennett's gifts, more joyful and more filled with laughter because of Bennett. Bennett created a character called Mitzvah Man, a superhero of sorts, who would attend our Hebrew school events. Mitzvah Man wore a costume, had a theme song, and offered ridiculous quizzes about what constituted a real or a made-up mitzvah that would have the kids rolling with laughter and learning at the same time. He also came as Moses on occasion and led the kids out of Egypt all around the synagogue grounds. Bennett was a gifted educator who, perhaps because he never abandoned his inner child, knew how to reach kids in the most playful way. But Bennett's most memorable, lasting, and defining contribution to the WJC was the annual Purim Shpiels he would compose. This lasted for 12 years in the early 2000s. And during that time, the WJC Purim Shpiels attained mythic status. Well deserved. For anybody who doesn't know Purim, it's the Jewish holiday on which we're commanded to make fun and have fun. We read the biblical book of Esther, which is a farcical satire itself. And over the centuries, Jewish communities started creating and performing their own parodies. It's like it was invented for Bennett. I'm proud to have been Bennett's collaborator on most of these productions. Each year, Bennett and I would think of a Broadway musical or a popular musical genre that would form the basis of our spiel. We would map out the goofy plot lines, and then Bennett would, in an astonishingly short amount of time, come back to me with a completed script and, of course, new song lyrics that were filled with achingly bad, hysterical puns. Our dedicated and talented cast of volunteer performers, costumers, set designers, and music directors would bring the script to life, and then on performance night, bring the house down to gales of laughter and appreciation. Those nights of silliness and pointed satire were the perfect remedy for our troubled and stressed out spirits. Bennett gave our community, his community, this gift every year. Bennett was willing to take more time to set up a punchline than anyone I know, anyone I've ever met. Sometimes an entire show was dedicated to a climactic pun that would pull the whole story together. I don't know if I should call it Bennett's chutzpah, his comedic genius, or his amazing lack of taste. But it was groan-worthy and hysterical at the same time. In an example, in his Wizard of Oz Purim Spiel, it was Esther's wedding day, and she is about to marry Morris Cohn. But Esther's very ambivalent about being Jewish. She wants to find a guru instead. So she runs away, has a car accident, and finds herself in Menschkin land, a land of little old Jews using walkers. Bennett played the part of the yellow big toad. Esther and her companions had to follow the yellow big toad to find the guru, etc., etc. This This was a full-length show, but suffice it to say that at the end, Esther learns her lesson and awakens back in the catering hall where her wedding is about to take place. Her uncle Mordecai says to her that if she really doesn't want to marry Morris Cohn, it's okay, we'll call off the wedding. But Esther says, "Oh no, Uncle Mordecai, if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. There's no mate like Cohn. No mate like Cohn." Curtain. And Bennett would come up with a new show just as bad and just as good, just as wildly creative and topical the next year. And he dealt with deep and real topics: assimilation, the follies of political power, Jewish pride, trusting in God. Thank you, Bennett. But now I want to add that Bennett was also a dedicated spiritual seeker. He was a man who was aware of his flaws, aware that he was a lot in so many ways, and was always working to improve himself. Bennett was always growing, always trying to be a better man. I watched Bennett grow. Bennett possessed deep spiritual insight. He took a class on Psalms with me, and in that class composed a spiritual interpretation of Psalm 27, which I have kept in my files to this day. Bennett reads this psalm as being about our internal spiritual struggles. When the psalm speaks of our enemies or foes, Bennett understands them to be the internal obstacles we struggle with that keep us from recognizing the oneness of all creation. Here's a small excerpt. "Only one thing I ask of the universe, to live in the consciousness of oneness all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the oneness of all things each day I am alive. For I will be protected from all harm inside the tent of oneness and raised high above my doubts to see the truth of our unity. Pay attention," says my heart, "to the truth of the oneness of all things. I seek to know and remember this truth. May it not be hidden from me." I want to conclude with a poem by Bennett's mother, Nora. Grandmother to David, Emily, Andy of blessed memory, and Lizzy. I hope we can all take comfort imagining Bennett and Norma reunited in heaven, delighted to the core to be together again. Norma loved coming to the Woodstock Jewish congregation, and we loved having her. When Norma passed away, Bennett collected her poems about death and dying into a little booklet so that others might benefit from his mother's wisdom. I saved this booklet, and so following Bennett's suggestion, I want to conclude with one of the poems. May it enlighten and lighten our spirits and bring us comfort. From Norma, Love Remains. Love doesn't die when the body's laid to rest. The spark within still burns with zest. And even when the body is gone, the love you have goes on and on. Love serves as a shining light, a ray of hope in the darkest night. Those melodies that sparked romance still can cause your feet to dance. The love that brought you joy and laughter remains with you forever after. May Bennett's memory be a blessing.
And now a musical tribute from Nora.
Hi everyone. I'm Simon. I'm Bennett's. Bennett was my father-in-law, and unlike Bennett's other children, I have the pleasure of distinctly recalling the very first time I heard Bennett's voice. Much like David and Emily, so I have the distinct memory of first hearing Bennett's voice. Unlike David, or much like David and Emily, the first time I heard Bennett's voice, I was naked and wet.
Go on.
Was it perfectly inappropriate? Yeah. I was in an attic in Burlington, Vermont, and I had just gotten out of the shower. My future father-in-law had left me a voicemail outlining a community that he was starting. A mutual friend of ours, Emily Sack, had connected Bennett and I. And I remember hearing his warm, salesman-y voice describing the project. My body lit up with excitement as he described word for word exactly what I'd been looking for, an eco-spiritual Jewish intentional community. I called him back within minutes, and he invited me to visit that afternoon for lunch. I called my boss at the university and got released from work that day and hopped into my navy blue Volkswagen convertible. And with the top down, I made my first trip to Accord, New York at the age of 22. If I could have known just how significant the impacts of this day would be. Navigating the maze of Elat Chaim's mildewy offices and facilities, I was walking into the office of the man who had fathered my wife-to-be, the man who would be Zeta to my daughters, and a loving, unabashed father to me. I was the first to join the Jewish intentional community that Bennett was creating at Elat Chaim. I told him I'd give it a shot for 3 months. I lived and worked there for 2.5 years. And during that time, I befriended Lizzy and Andy. And out of the corner of my eye, I appreciated the beautiful daughter Bennett had living on the West Coast. Her glamour shot was on one of the walls. It's adjacent to our shared kitchen. Even before I married his daughter, Bennett had become one of my surrogate parents. He was offering me guidance and love and support. He helped me create one of his signature personal visionary plans using colorful Post-it notes. He supported me to implement my goals, addressing my back taxes and breaking the overwhelming process down into logical to-dos and troubleshooting with me every step of the way. He lent me his courage, his math savvy, and his strong executive functioning, and in doing so, he was by my side as I flexed these very resources within myself. Bennett became a father to me. When we were pregnant with our first daughter, David, Emily, and I brought Dad to his first fish show. It was May of 2011, and life was so hopeful. Barack Obama was president. I drove a convertible. Emily was 4.5 months pregnant. Andy was living with Louise in Chicago. And Bennett and Sandi lived 10 minutes down the road from us. The four of us regularly would have dinner together, sharing Chinese food and hot tub soaks at their house in New Paltz. Well, Em would she would keep her feet into the hot tub so as not to cook Nora before she was born. Back to the fish show. During an epic bathtub jam, under the blackened, star-sprinkled sky, Dad held me and encouraged me to lean back into his arms and to look up, taking in all of the love that he and the universe have for me. Holding me, he whispered so much love into me, a love as boundless as the sky. And from this experience forward, I found myself easily referring to him as Dad. Over the coming years, Bennett would share much of this love with his granddaughters. He'd entertain them while reading in animated voices, inviting them to play his face, and much to our distaste, allowing them to watch too many videos on his phone. And in his usual way, occasionally answering their questions without any regard for appropriate boundaries. Time with Zeta was eccentric, fun, and love-soaked. When I think of Dad's legacy, I can see his soul's fingerprints most clearly in his children. The Neiman social fearlessness, their brazen, can do absolutely anythingness, and their colorful creativity is impossible to miss. And clearly its roots lie in Bennett's fathering. May we all be as shameless as they can be. This December, in our last few days with Bennett, as it was clear these were Dad's final days, the Neiman irreverence for boundaries grew all the more resolute. Laying beside Dad in his bed, Emily asked why he hadn't called her more throughout her life. In the conversation that followed, it became clear to me just how painful of a role shame had played for Dad. Ironically, the man who seemed to know no shame socially was plagued by it. He had shamed himself away from his children. And as is the case for so many of us, the very thing he felt couldn't be shared with others created the very dynamic he most feared. During our last days with Dad, there wasn't much that was pretty. We sat together, loving one another in his misery and acknowledging his shame. And rather than separating us, it served as more ground for connection. As we remember Bennett today, I hope that we all can be as brave and vulnerable as Bennett and Emily were in his last days. May we all ask the questions we most deeply wish to ask. And may we name whatever shadows prevent us from being connected, inviting the ugly truth of who we are to be a part of our intimate relationships. To close out, I'd like to share with you, word for word, the speech that Dad gave at our wedding back in 2010. Just kidding. I wish the camera was on David and Emily's face. No! Zeta, Bennett, Dad, may your granddaughters, your children, your friends, your exes, and those whom we love benefit from your memory. May we all open to this life with more social fearlessness, more brazen, can-do-anythingness, and more colorful creativity. Dad, you're missed, and you're well-loved. Root for us from the other side, and please, work your can-do-anything magic to make these next many years much easier than the last two.
Amen.
Amen.
Love you guys.
Simon, thank you. So you married your sister, right? My name is Mark Kelso, and I was honored to call Ben a collaborator and a friend. We're both kind of boundaryless songwriters, and so I felt like the best thing to do is just to think I can remember. A little dance, a lot of song, to draw your people round where they belong. A little weed, a little wine, and a lot of love for the ones you've left behind. Oh, Ben, my friend, it's not the end, and I'm sure I'll see you somewhere around the bend, beyond all time, beyond all space. I feel your love here now around this place. Oh, Ben, my friend, it's not the end. As you move on toward the one, on the way I'm sure you'll meet your rising sun and be reunited. Now at last you'll reminisce as you forget the past. Oh, Ben, my friend, it's not the end, and I'm sure I'll see you somewhere around Ben, beyond all time, beyond all space. I feel your love now here around this place. Oh, Ben, my friend, it's not the end. And it's not about perfection, doing things just right. It's loving those who love you with all your heart and all your might. When your hourglass is empty, sand is all run out, still you leave behind a life of which you can be proud. Oh, Ben, my friend, it's not the end,
eulogizing Bennett on Shabbos in a church. Perfect. And doing El Malei Rachamim, the prayer that speaks our intention to lift this memory, this life into the compassionate heart of unity. And saying the Mourner's Kaddish, which you just offered a beautiful translation of. There is no end, beyond all song and prayer. Returning this part of God back to God that is the life and the color and the vibrancy of Bennett Neiman. I'll now chant this prayer, El Malei Rachamim, and the word that stands out to me is Hamtzeh, find rest. For a seeker, for a creative, for a complicated soul, what might it be like to rest in return to the bond of life? So if you're comfortable and you're able, please rise. I'll chant El Malei Rachamim, and then the family and all the community mourners will have the opportunity to say Kaddish together. And another anachronism is this is usually the last part of a service, but this is actually just deepening us to the finale in a way that Bennett already knew he wanted for himself. El Malei Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hamtzeh Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Shechina B'malot Kedoshim Uteorim Kizohar Rakia Mazhirim Et Nishmat Benyamin Aharon Ben Nechama Shehalach Leolamo Began Eden Tehei Menuchato Ana Bal Rachamim Hastirenu Beseter Knafecha Lolamim Utzror B'tzror Achayim Et Nishmato Adonai Hu Nachalato Lianoach B'Shalom Al Mishkevo. And let us sing Amen. Gadal, V'yitgadash Shemei Rabah, Ve'aloman Tibrach Yutei Yemich Malchutei, V'chayechon Yomechon, V'chayei B'chol B'Yisrael, V'agabam Zman Karim V'yimru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabam V'rach Ve'olam V'nei Omaya. V'yitvarach V'yishkavach V'yitpahar V'yitkoram V'yitnaseh. V'yitadar V'yitpaleh V'yitpalal Shemei V'kusha V'rechu. Lehilam Min Kol B'vratav Shirata. Tushbechata B'nechamata. Hariram Le'olam V'yimru Amen. Yehei Shmama Rabba Min Shemaya. V'chayim Alinu Kol Yisrael. V'yimru Amen. Oseh Shalom V'yimrav. U'yaseh Shalom. Oleinu Kol Yisrael. V'yimru Amen. Holy bracha, may this memory be a forever blessing. You may be seated. We'll now have Espadine, we'll now have eulogies from Sandi and Nora.
word Basher conveys both the soulmate and predestined partner chosen by God. It means a lot more than meant to be, as it presumes a set of circumstances or situations orchestrated at a spiritual level, conjuring a match made in heaven. Bennett and I met at a Broadway show. Fitting. Guys and Dolls, when our two daughters, who knew each other from Nashville, ran into one another and introduced us. We weren't even supposed to be in the show that night, but the lead was sick the night before, and we exchanged our tickets. We were across the aisle in the same row. We were quite taken with each other from the start, but we remained friends for over 2 years until we got together. We became fast friends and had a lot in common. He told me he was from Cincinnati, and when I asked where, he told me he was from Finneytown, and I almost fainted because my ex of 23 years grew up there too, in a tiny little village. Getting to know each other, we talked about birthdays, important events in our lives, and all the usual things. Bennett was born on October 3rd, the same birthday as my high school college boyfriend, and the date my father died. Lizzy was born the day my mother died. My birthday's the same day as his mother's birthday, and his father and my sister have the same birthday. Our granddaughter Nora shares a birthday with my oldest daughter Taylor. But really, I mean, statistically, it's impossible without it being Basher, right? I have no other explanation. Everyone thinks they have the best husband, but Bennett was truly a great one to me. I know he came pre-trained. But he was a loyal, adoring, affectionate, and thoughtful man with a sharp wit and a knack for unusual songs, usually about penises and poop. He brought coffee to me every morning and showed up randomly with dozens of roses. It wasn't the material things that I will remember. It's that I could always count on him. He was safe to me. And as a marriage counselor, I can truly say that he was a great partner, a great friend, a great lover, confidant, and householder. So many people have reached out with stories about him, always expressing how he made them feel, which is special and seen. He connected deeply with people, considered strangers just friends he hadn't yet made. In fact, one of our closest friends is a young man from India who Bennett befriended on the megabus en route to a bridge tournament. This was not unusual for him. He had long friendships, most especially with his best friend Mark since he was 12. He treasured their time together. Bennett will be remembered as an effervescent, highly creative, irreverent, hilariously funny, brilliant, compassionate, and kind man. He loved to include all the orphans in our holidays, so nobody would be alone for Seder. He quelled continuously about his children and marveled at how creative, brilliant, and talented they were, always going like this. He had a special relationship with his granddaughters and adored spending time with them. Throughout this time, while he was sick, when he would FaceTime with them, he never stopped making jokes and funny faces with them. As our marriage matured, we knew that we had put the work in to create a sustainable and loving marriage for the long term. We were committed to one another unconditionally and truly never fought or argued. We accepted each other entirely and thrived within the safety of our love. We truly helped smooth each other's rough edges only in the best possible ways. During COVID, my lovely husband, who had brought coffee to my bedside every single morning we were together, suddenly began to forget, which I attributed to the pandemic, the sense of unreality and the fact that Andy was struggling dearly and calling him almost daily. He began to nap more often and for longer periods, became disinterested in his usual hobbies, writing and creating scatological or penis songs. Throughout the pandemic, being isolated together was actually a joy. We marveled every night at how lucky we were, enjoying movies together and Zooming with friends. It was not a hardship for us. We remained quarantined with this, to remain quarantined with this lively, creative, and endlessly positive man was a gift to me. Okay, list of three. They say it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, and I take those words to heart, but I had the great love, the adoring husband, and the truly equal, fulfilling marriage. And I will miss him every single day.
It was August in St. Louis, 1984, which meant a thunderstorm that could raise the hairs on even the most veteran Midwesterner's neck. Like the gods were in a brawl. I was 4, and it was the middle of the night, which made it all the scarier. I was roused from sleep, and there it came. Cataclysmic crash. Without any premeditation, I ran towards my bedroom door, bound for my parents' bed. When I opened the door and ran into the small bit of landing separating my parents' room and mine, lo and behold, at that exact same moment, my father was running out of his room, bound for mine. If ever there was a superhero move which ascribed omnipotence to my dad, it was this moment. He was a knight in shining armor incarnate. This is the earliest strong memory I have of my dad, and it would be a mythologized part of our bond that would continue for the rest of my life. The majority of my memories of dad are after the separation from my mom, and is absolutely wrecked, as I was for them to divorce, and ultimately at 10 for him to move away. I've often thought that it is because of their divorce and his moving away that so many of my most pristine dad memories are also seminal moments in my life. The visits to and time spent with him were pointed, distilled, precious. Of those stories, some were seemingly benign, but retrospectively profound. Like the time when at 8.5 years old, I picked up a National Enquirer while in line with him at the grocery store and said, "What's this?" And my dad very quickly and uncharacteristically sternly retorted, "Don't read that, Emily. Only people who are dissatisfied with their lives read that." To this day, I have never purchased a tabloid or even a People magazine. And in my teens and 20s, when I found myself being sucked into some random, totally meaningless gossip about Angelina Jolie alleging Brad Pitt abused one of their 12 children, I would quickly pivot, remembering my dad's pithy indictment. And one of the few times he told me that something was categorically bad, just to bring it full circle, what is the social media realm we are living in, if not one big tabloid? The formative guidance from my father cemented this awareness of what was driving my any urge I had to voyeuristically peer into others' lives and judge. At 12 and a half, at my bat mitzvah, my dad gave a most heartfelt blessing from memory, as he always did for these types of occasions. Tears collecting in his eyes, as was always the case. And then he took the opportunity to finish his beautiful words with one explicit instruction. Never lose your sense of humor or cease being silly. Grown-ups often forget this, and you'll promise me that, even when people are watching. I nodded dutifully. He then said, to commemorate that, I want you to play the other instrument you love to play besides the flute. And then and there, 2 months before going into 7th grade, I was challenged to reveal in front of 20 peers and 100 adults that in my private moments, I do indeed like to play my dad's face. In the video of this moment, I look embarrassed, to be sure, but also so joyful. And truly, this was another piece of counsel I have held steadfast to. And when I couldn't, in certain parts of adolescence, when I stifled these silly impulses because of crippling self-consciousness, my soul felt squashed. My Neiman-ness must be allowed to soar. And that can result, as it often did with my dad, in onlookers shaking their head and saying, "You're crazy." Well worth it, right, Dad? Then came the fateful summer following my 7th grade year. I now had a new baby half-sister, and she, Chris, and my father were living in Lenox, Massachusetts. My dad and his friends were just about the age I am now, and I was a 13-year-old who just recently began to question the prevailing values that my friends upheld and that I raced to achieve within. I was a seriously committed academic with a great deal of popularity, but something broke just a little that spring. And now I found myself spending many days a week at an ashram. Yes, Kirpalo was still an ashram in 1993. And my dad was one of maybe 3 paid employees, and talking a great deal with 40-somethings about the nature of life. I was frankly enraptured, totally gratified. They were not treating me like some kid. They were giving me the floor and valuing my thinking and gushing about my precocity. It was so electric to spend my days with them. I felt so affirmed and uplifted. But then came the gut punch. I ended up seeing a video of a monologue that Dad had written for a special men's work group he was in. He was very proud of it, and he wanted me to see it. But then he gave an explicit instruction not to watch the second tape. And what was a budding adolescent to do other than the exact opposite of what I'd been instructed? It was a full disclosure rant about the past. And it all flooded over me like sordid fiction. I should turn this off. Why can't I turn this off? When it was over, I think I must have had a system breakdown. I tried sublimating, but it found its way out. By the time of my Christmas break visit 5 months later, he looked at me and in this way of championing the truth over all else, said, "You watched tape 2, didn't you?" I nodded, somewhat guiltily, but with great relief. We spent that New Year's Eve at Friendly's, innocently eating ice cream Sundays, while my dad gave me the space to ask him anything that was coming up for me around what I heard. We ended the night in ecstatic dancing at Kirpalo. Suffice it to say, 8th grade was a disaster. I couldn't quite assimilate the information. It was too much, it was too soon, and the contrast of having spent 2 months of my summer in conversation about spirituality and our internal emotional landscape with great self-effacement, with the now fierce gossip and self-consciousness and vapidity that pervaded my peers, was too much soul dissonance. I went into a dark depression, but I did not love my father any less. I just built a greater space in my heart to accommodate his frailties. Flash forward to 2nd semester, junior year of high school. I was feeling so forlorn again. I had managed to decently like freshman year and to even love parts of sophomore year, but now I was slipping into malaise again, and I was not willing to ever feel like the despondence I felt in my 8th grade year. So I was on the phone with Dad saying, I cannot stay in St. Louis with these people. Isn't there something we can dream of? Preferably involving France? Okay, let me see what I can do. The very next day, The very next day, he calls excitedly and says, "Em, I figured it out. My friend and colleague Mitch is married to a wonderful French woman, and her cousin lives in the poshest part of Paris with her 3 children. One of them is nearly your age, and he will come stay with me in the summer in Woodstock, and then you will go live with them in Paris for the fall. An even exchange." I couldn't believe it. He just made it all seem so simple. And I didn't feel any trepidation or skepticism, just pure elation. And sure enough, I made my first transatlantic voyage, my first trip out of the country at 17 years old, and stayed for 2.5 months in Paris, and then traveled Europe for a month. If you've ever played the game with a fellow adult of choosing what were the 5 most influential experiences that have shaped your life, this would most assuredly make my list. It was this experience that allowed me to see the ethnocentric bubble we all live in. It facilitated me becoming fluent in French. And I mentioned that I traveled Europe for 30 days. Well, 3 of those days were spent discovering London with the one Bennett Neiman. Oh boy, did he rock that itinerary. Itineraries! My dad's most finely tuned language of his first 60 years, always on a legal pad with a ballpoint pen. We ate Indian food, the best of my life. We went to the Savoy Theater, the Old Vic, the Young Vic. I thought I'd seen great theater in my inaugural New York City Broadway experience at 16, also a Dad and Me extravaganza. But now I was stopped in my tracks by the staggering talent on the London stage. And it was all topped off with a trip to Harrods, the most exquisite department store I've ever set foot in. I came away from it with a crystal necklace, which felt to me to be fit for a queen. And truly, that is how my dad made me feel. When I was back stateside, Dad invited me to be his assistant at one of his work gigs. He was working as a consultant for several different large companies, and his role, as I characterized it then, was a therapist for corporations. The company was Raytheon, and the room was filled with a bunch of Republican ISTJs. That's a Myers-Briggs reference. My dad and I prepped the room by putting up printed large font quotes all over the room, like from the likes of Gandhi and Emily Dickinson and Einstein. And one that particularly stands out was a Wayne Gretzky quote: "You miss 100% of the shots you never take." See my dad's extremely extroverted, if not boisterous demeanor as he walked around the room in his efforts to infuse passion into these hyper-mathematical types was something to behold. You see, my dad's first job was as a high school math teacher. He was an obsessive logic problem puzzle solver. His mind loved nothing more than creating a strategic solution to any problem. This was the language of these Raytheon engineers. And at the same time, he was full of zest and charisma and passion and was doing his darndest to elicit some feeling from these people so that it might boost morale and they might coalesce to reach their short-term and long-term goals more efficiently and effectively. It was a magical day to be freshly back from Paris, just having turned 18 and seeing the workforce in a way that reverberated with inspiration and transformation. With my dad at the helm was awe-inspiring. What's more, he treated me like an equal, involving me whenever he could, even in some of the facilitation. Okay, now I feel conflicted because I have somewhere in the neighborhood of 37 formative stories with my father I cannot tell because there are children present. Mom, Simon, I'm crediting your boundaried influence for enabling me to make that choice to omit these. Okay, I'm just gonna tell one. It was a long weekend off from first semester at NYU. Only about a month in, my 2 years older boyfriend and I were trying to do the long distance thing. So he came to visit me in my dorm for several days, and then we trained it up to my dad's in Woodstock. Dad showed us to our room, and rather excitedly wished us a great night, and said, "Left you something on the nightstand?" And it was cinnamon. Cinnamon lube. Some of you might be horrified at this point, but having grown up with this man, I cackled, as did my boyfriend, and we gave it a whirl. Horrible. Let's just say the spice was not fun. Just a couple of months after the cinnamon lube incident, it was suddenly brought to my attention on an irritated phone call from my mom that I owed $1,700 for my contribution to my NYU education. It was completely off my radar, and I was destitute at the time, to the point of turning over couch cushions for quarters to ride the subway. So when is this due, Mom? In 1 month. How do you expect me to do this, Mom? Emily, you've known about this for almost a year. I don't know. Call your father. Asking Bennett Neiman for money, or just any money handlings with him at all, ranked among my least favorite things in the world. He was ingenious as hell and bolder than a Kardashian, but extremely frugal and fearful around money. So I mustered my most charming affect and explained to him the situation. There was a pause and then a calm, "So how long have you known about this, Em?" "Well, technically a year, but really just right now." Another pregnant pause. Absolutely zero moralizing or scolding. Just a fervently loving tone and the words, "Emily, I believe in you. I know you can do it. Take care." I was aghast. I put the receiver down and said aloud to no one, "My father wants me to prostitute myself." I thought very hard about any possible way out of this. I recalled that a manager from the Blue Note Jazz Club had come into the coffee shop where I held a job for 2 months before it had to close its doors. We had a little connection. I knew it was time to capitalize off that. With zero experience waiting tables of any kind, at 18 years old, I waltzed into the world-renowned boutique jazz club and landed myself a cocktailing gig. I saw and got to consort with the likes of Roberta Flack, Natalie Cole, Lauryn Hill, and B.B. King. And while getting to witness these outstanding musical acts, I was also paid obscene amounts of money. In 1997, in just 2 weeks of working there, while a full-time undergrad at Tisch, I earned those $1,700. Mailing that check was one of the most pride-filled moments of my entire life. It might seem strange that my father's simple, sturdy declaration could have cajoled me so, but it did. I had seen him so many times model that even the seemingly impossible is possible. And now I, with my own fortitude and industry, and okay, maybe a little Neiman charisma, had proven that it was true. Okay, so we've only made it to age 19 and I have already been up here 10 minutes. So, in the name of Pith, we're gonna go to 2007. Those stories in the formative years, I think, paint the picture that my father's influence on my values, my worldview, my personality was inalienable. But the greatest concrete gift that Bennett Neiman offered me was my eventual husband, Simon Abramson. In 2004, my dad had become the executive director for a Jewish spiritual retreat center called Eliyah just over in Accord. The place was run down, and it was his vision to create an eco-spiritual Jewish intentional community. Let's get a bunch of young people to come breathe life into this place. My dad interviewed people for this cohort, and the very first young person to commit to this endeavor was a boy from Vermont, in Vermont, just shy of 23 years old. I joke that I had an arranged marriage, but the truth is, it didn't even cross my dad nor anyone's mind that this would be Emily's future husband. On paper, we were total opposites. But 2.5 years later, I met him at my half-sister Lizzie's bat mitzvah, and sparks flew. I still lived in Los Angeles then, and Simon was no longer at the retreat center, but still in upstate New York. Took me another 8 months to move to the East Coast, and I wasn't moving for Simon, but when we met again in the gallery of my dad's then fiancé, we embraced like only star-crossed lovers could. That felt image of our hug, with our stomachs pressed against one another, was made all the more memorable when, as we pulled apart, we saw that my dad was standing extremely close to us with a huge self-assured grin, saying, And from that day forward, he would always refer to Simon as his future son-in-law. Not so long after that, Ben Neiman became a Zeta, a role he loved to fill, in particular with Nora, with whom he spent the most time, and as he was still in the area for the first year of her life. In some ways, as he himself noted, being a grandfather was the task he was always cut out for. Swooping in with the grand entrances, entertaining and inspiring giggles, and then taking his leave to go home. Upon learning that Dad had dementia, it became clear that I would no longer be okay with just the occasional phone call and the once every 4 to 5 month visits. Moreover, it was becoming exponentially harder for him to travel. In September, I booked 2 trips to Austin, one with just me and Nora on Halloween weekend, and then what would be the final one in the last few days of 2022, with just Simon. I made such a good choice. The Halloween trip, which included David and Amanda and Lizzy, was incredible. My dad had an awakening, a sudden ability to be out of bed for the better part of the day, present, laughing, eating and enjoying the food. It was precisely the type of moment I hoped to collect when I resolved to see him frequently once it was clear his decline was precipitous. The December trip was different. I saw the man that Sandi had told me about many times, the one I hoped could be cured, the scared, sad, sick, deflated Will man who I loved all the more, just as he was. Unlike the time 2 months prior, I could barely convince him to get out of bed. My presence did not lift him out of his depression. I feel so honored and so grateful that I got to spend many hours over those 3 days just lying next to him, spooning him. In one of our final moments together, I mindlessly hummed the first line from The Lonely Goat Herd from Sound of Music. And there was a momentary pause, and then my dad, who I thought was sleeping or checked out, just came in immediately with do 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 do. And then we sang the entire song, just like that, with alternating lines flawlessly. We both guffawed at the end, so filled up by our silly synchronicity. I love you so much, Dad. I'm so lucky to have had so many meaningful experiences with you, to have felt so much kinship with you, to have laughed so hard and had so much fun with you, and to have felt unwavering adoration from and for you. In those final moments of holding you, I felt such serenity that I can only compare to a mother holding her feverish child. I wasn't fighting against your pitiful moans or of wanting it to all be over. As you kept repeating, you've lived a full life. You had done everything you needed to, and you were clearly done. Well, my heart could accommodate your frailties. And as before, I loved you even though you couldn't stay. But just like any great showman, you've left me wanting more.
On my bubby's deathbed in 2010, just before her last dying breath, she held my father's face in her hand and said to him with tears in her eyes, "I'm the luckiest woman in the world." Some backstory here. My bubby did not have an easy life. One of her sisters was killed when she was just a little girl. My grandfather, she spent most of her life with, was a vicious, verbally abusive man. Not unrelated to the general crazy of my family. But my bubby endured all of this. They struggled financially, and to anyone who saw her life would have considered it hard. Yet when my bubby said this to my father, she meant it. I could see how moved Dad was by her sincere gratitude in the face of a whole lot of shit. He said to us, "I want to be able to say that." We were all touched. So, Bubby's service is the next morning, and before it starts, they allowed our immediate family into the side room to be with her in open casket. We're all standing over her. My dad is speaking to his mother, and he begins to sob. He sobbed harder than I've ever seen anyone sob in my entire life. My Uncle Jimmy comes over and begins reading from the Talmud. My dad puts his head into Jimmy's chest and wails more. Jimmy finishes, and as Andy and I come over to hold my father, as his sobbing only crescendos louder. This was grieving I have never seen before. And eventually, Andy lets go of my father, and I have him cradled in my arms, his head at my chest like a newborn babe. He looks up at me with tears in his eyes, wipes them away, and goes, "I'm the luckiest woman in the world." Andy and I and the rest of our family double over in a fit of laughter and tears as we usher in the memorial service of one of our favorite human beings of all time. This was Bennett Alan Neiman wrapped up in a bow. All growing up, my father was the funniest, most charismatic, most handsome, and to be sure, most inappropriate man I ever knew. I know, everybody thinks this about their dad, but no, really seriously, mine was. I'm sure that everyone already fully concedes the inappropriate part. The dad guy, or father person, was how he usually referred to himself in our presence. And while he usually called us Dodo Head, or my little Garbanzo bean, in case anybody was confused about that flyer that went out. From the moment I was born, everything was theatrical and playtime. He taught us Sabbath prayer from Fiddler on the Roof, as if it were a legitimate prayer of Shabbat. Every Friday night, my mom would light the candles, and my family would haul off and sing the entire Sabbath prayer like it was opening night on Broadway. Mom and Dad harmonized together just like Golda. And Sunday school, I noticed a kid or two was tone deaf and thought to myself, man, their Sabbath prayer on Friday night must be a train wreck. When I was finally introduced to the soundtrack of Fiddler on the Roof for the first time, years after this song had residency at our Shabbos table, I thought, isn't it a little bit chutzpahdik for a Broadway musical to steal a legitimate Jewish prayer that Dad taught us for their show? I mean, shouldn't they pay royalties to a Jewish authority somewhere? Someone really ought to say something. But Dad's true religion was writing parody songs from Broadway musicals. His morning daily ritual was shitting with the door wide open for at least 45 minutes at a time, writing on one of his 100 yellow legal pads found all over the house. Whenever he wasn't working, he was writing a parody. Be it an upcoming birthday, bar mitzvah, or friggin' Arbor Day. It did not matter the occasion. When Andy was 6, he wrote a parody to I Think I'm Gonna Like It Here from Annie, his cunning spin, 'cause Andy Neiman's 6 years old. Bam! Take that, Weird Al. He couldn't simply just write a song and call it a gift like a halfway normal person. My dad had to up and write at least 8 songs for these occasions, and all from the same Broadway musical he had chosen, and churn them out like he was stamping signatures. So if this meant a song or 5 was a little rough around the witty edges, so be it. How many different attributes about a human being can you write an entire song about? Its result was utterly absurd minutia no one in their right mind has to address once, let alone honor with an entire song. He once wrote a whole song to the tune of Give My Regards to Broadway, part of a whole musical about how his friend Jerry Bronstein hated it when people loudly smacked their gum. So don't crack your gum round good old Jer, or Jerry will crack your head. Bizarre songs defined Dad's character. He would walk around the house, singing lyrics as they flew into his head, and sometimes those would become songs forever. Oh, what about your nose and your ears and your mouth? What about traveling down to the south? And knows this. What about your nose and your mouth and your ears? Usually he'd be making up as he went along. I'm a little dodo head and so are you. And he'd be like, Dad, please stop. Dad, please stop. Are you going to keep doing that? Or are you going to keep doing that? Yes, I am. Whenever we mess something up, he'd go, you have the brain of a small kangaroo. And whenever he messed something up, he'd go, I'm a fuck up. And whenever it was really bad, he'd go, I'm a stupid, stupid fuckhead. To anyone offended right now, for those who knew Ben Neiman at all, there is no more appropriate way to truly honor him than being inappropriate at his memorial service. And if ever there was a truer statement, I learned it from watching you. Rather poetic, my father, Andy, and my initials spelled out in order was bad. Ben, Andy, David. And for this reason, when I was a little boy, we would used to go places Dad would strut, hey, we bad. We were a little bad. And he would say absolutely anything to make his point. In 1984, President Reagan defeated Walter Mondale in the biggest landslide in U.S. history. We held a mock election in my 3rd grade class just prior, so due to blind alignment with my parents, I voted for the biggest loser of all time, the most unpopular candidate in history, and he was a Democrat. So the next day, I challenged him, Dad, why are you a Democrat? Even the way I said Democrat, he could hear the disgust in my inflection. Dad pauses and goes, so little black babies can eat? I understood. And from that moment forward, I was a Democrat, and proud. My father taught me so many important values. Since we were only 6, every year he took Andy, Emily, and me to lead the high holiday services and Passover with him at a Jewish assisted living facility. I think he also wanted us to get the performance bug into our systems sooner rather than later. He taught me so many important values, even by showing strength in harder moments. Some of our early childhood best friends were Terry and Jerry, who lived directly behind us. So one day, Jerry has a brilliant idea for us to sell baseball cards and women's jewelry together at last. He grabbed some jewelry from his house, I grabbed baseball cards from mine, and off we go. The first house we stopped at was across the street, who turns out was an off-duty cop, who called his entire precinct on us. As it turned out, on Jerry, who was black. We were 6 and 8 years old. Literally 5 cop cars roll up to the house. Jerry is terrified and sobbing. And I was just confused. Dad comes over in minutes. I thought he was going to be infuriated with me. He goes, "What is the meaning of this?" To the cop, not to me and Jerry. The cop goes, "This kid was selling hot jewelry." Dad asks where Jerry got it, which of course was from his auntie, who he lived with. "You had to call the entire precinct on him?" "Yeah, it's illegal." "He's 8. You made your point." "It's the only way they'll learn." "They?" Yeah, this kid and your son." My dad scowled at the cop. "Anyway, our officer will escort the boy home." My dad immediately put his arm around Jerry. "No, you won't." And he took us out of there, consoling my broken friend as he walked him back home. I only understood about half of the story as it was happening. But it was the gift that kept on giving as it related to my maturation and view of the world back in Missouri in the early 80s. One of the places my father was most comfortable was in front of a large audience. Public speaking was his greatest talent. In fact, he enjoyed it so much, he would contrive mini versions of them even when there was no venue for it whatsoever. He would constantly walk into rooms and declare, "I'm making an announcement." That's right. My father was so obsessed with announcements, he had an announcement for his announcement. And it was never something of actual importance. "I'm making an announcement. We're leaving in 5 minutes." "I'm making an announcement." What food are people interested in first? "I'm making an announcement. The father person is going to sleep." And because he was such a broadcaster, whatever private information he had gotten hold of about anyone was as good as aired to the majority of the Western Hemisphere, no matter how delicate the subject, which only made us feel more self-conscious when we were with them. "Hey, everyone, please be sweet to Rose today because she just found out yesterday she has breast cancer and she's really upset about it, but you're not supposed to know, so don't say anything." My father wasn't just a performer, though. He was an absolutely phenomenal audience member, if he liked what he was watching. Otherwise, he was already in the parking lot in his mind in under 5 minutes, and in the actual parking lot in about 10. But from the time we were young through college, if it were one of our plays or musicals, I knew it would be a great show that night because Dad was in the crowd. Many audiences are colder without someone to give permission to laugh loudly at all the jokes or applaud enthusiastically. Bennett Neiman was that guy. And it always brought an electricity to every performance. Fellow actors would literally thank me after the show for his presence. Theater companies far and wide should have paid him to be a ringer in the audience. In 1995, we got stoned out of our minds and went to see Miss Saigon on Broadway with amazing seats. Not the most cliche father-son activity, yet one that perfectly embodied the culture of our family. In the middle of the show is a song called Bui Doi. It means the dust of life. It's all about the children in Saigon who had been born out of the Vietnamese prostitutes with the American GI soldiers that, of course, abandoned them after the war. It's a stirring song, but obviously quite serious in tone. Well, the song ends, the crowd applauds with reverence, and Dad immediately stands up in one of the front rows of this huge Broadway theater by himself. "Yeah! Woo! Unbelievable! Bravo! Bravo!" I was embarrassed, entertained, and oddly proud, which sort of summed up what it meant to be Bennett Neiman's son. He once said to me when I was still young, David, people are sheep. Don't be one of them. One might say I heeded this advice too closely. And that sometimes got me into trouble because he wasn't always there to give me the other guidance that I needed to qualify that sentiment along the way. Because he was always going fast. Go fast. When we were getting ready to leave the house, he'd say, go fast, go fast. That was the gear he consistently rode on at all times. It's how he functioned. It's who he was. And he insisted we all hop along for the ride. He could not and would not be a single minute late, whether it was going to temple, seeing film, or playing hide and seek in the fucking park. It didn't matter. Consequently, he loved driving. But when he was moving, making progress, in control, going fast, he was comfortable. He'd play all the golden oldies to us from this sacred audio compilation, part of a massive, hilarious Marx Brother-esque ad campaign for Pepsi Cola in 5 installments that he created back in the late 70s when he was just first getting his start as an ad man, called The Strange Loner. Andy and I memorized every word of this thing. And while Dad was such a people person, he was always moving, always running. Why I think he often couldn't hold on to many relationships well, and why he couldn't hang around once he was forced to slow it all down. I always sort of thought of Dad as the strange loner, which leads me to this gem. In 1989, following the newly divorced father's hand guide through a midlife crisis, Dad whisked away to India for 2 months. His hyper-planned objective, of course, to find himself. So he decides the best way to accomplish this goal is to get intentionally lost, all alone in the middle of the Indian jungle. He would be living poetry, a story for the ages. He'd look within, unearthing the many questions he had not been prepared to ask until this poignant moment. Journey back to civilization, riding upon an elephant, hailed a hero, far and wide. Unfortunately, after about 2 hours, it dawned on the strange loner that he had no wilderness skills to speak of, no food or water, nor trust in himself. What he did have was a catastrophic level of hubris that could inspire a man to lengths this irresponsible, fueled by its broadcast to the universe, when its very intention to begin with is the meaning of private. Yes, my father's planned version of finding himself had resulted in being more lost than he had ever been in his entire life. So he begins to panic as the first logical effort he made in the entire day, and now screaming for anyone to hear him. No one was there. Sane people don't go out into the middle of the Indian jungle alone with no water unless they're intentionally escorting themselves to their own funeral. So after a couple more hours, sun's going down, he starts sprinting to get the hell out of there. He hits his foot on a tree stump, tripping him face down into a large water hole that turns out is an enormous pit of leeches. So now he's tearing down the Indian mountainside, screaming bloody murder, while picking leeches off his bloody, soaking wet body, screaming and kicking and hysterical, until he finally realizes he had miraculously found his way back to town. It was like, ah! He beelines into the shower, taking with him his soap and his shoe. He rips about 30 leeches off his body, beating them to a pulp, sobbing uncontrollably on the shower floor, at long last, having found himself. I always loved this story. So much. Perhaps too much. Dad could never understand why it made me laugh so hard. He'd be like, David, you do understand I almost died, right? Which, of course, only made me laugh harder. The story serves as perfect Bennett Neiman parable, illustrating at once both who he strived to be in all of his hyper-planning, marquee flashing lights and theatrical glory, and who he actually was, and the insanity and the hardship of how that played out over time. That's another thing he'd always do, to broadcast that he was listening to something poignant you might be sharing, usually when he wasn't listening. Yep, my father was an entertainer for the ages. The Music Man, P.T. Barnum. He had endured such intense trauma and public humiliation from my papa growing up that he knew the only way out was to use it. And assuming his greatest asset was his creative talent and showmanship, he used these crazy true stories about my grandfather, which were really all the many traumas of his own childhood, and made them absolutely hilarious. Jake be named taxpayer. I pay taxes, so you work for me. In fact, he used these very stories to make my mother fall in love with him on their first date together. That is what a world-class survivor and true entertainer my father was. But the harder truth is that he carried with him the shame of this nightmarish childhood and was never able to fully heal from it. And it got the better of him. By the time I was 12, he told himself the story that Andy, Emily, and I would be okay, possibly even better off, without his presence in St. Louis. No, he was not the hero of the story. That was his line he'd open with whenever he had to admit something he was ashamed of. I'm not the hero of the story, David. I was devastated when he moved away, because he wasn't just a father to me. He was a true friend, and only made that so much more painful and confusing. We shared guttural laughter, a profound friendship that few fathers and sons know, and depending on which utterly boundaryless moments some might argue shouldn't have. But boundaries and convention weren't in Ben Neiman's vocabulary, and countless gifts lived outside of those parameters that were given to me and my siblings because of it. But see, being entertaining wasn't Ben Neiman's greatest asset. His heart was. My dad cried at everything. He cried at my stepmother is an alien. Really. He's the reason I have arguably too much access to my tears for a grown man. And my father also had to endure his own abandonment. In 1978, he tragically lost his best friend and rabbi of our synagogue he was deeply tied to at the time, Arnie Asher, who was only 41 when my dad was only 28. This is why Emily is Emily Asher. But every July, on the anniversary of Arnie's death, he used to take Andy and I to the cemetery. He'd stand at the foot of Arnie's grave and read a poem entitled Don't Cry for Arnie that he had written as his powerful eulogy he performed at Arnie's funeral. It was the chorus that he resounded repeatedly throughout. Don't cry for Arnie. Cry for the millions who never knew him, who were never touched by his magic. Approaching the finale, his emotions would crescendo, his anguish and tears mounting. He was my strength, my direction, my advisor, my seeker, my model, my best friend. Until he screamed out the poem's final heartbreaking words, don't cry for Arnie, cry for me, Dan. Cry for me. He closed the book slowly, looked down, and sobbed uncontrollably. My brother and I watched, uncomfortable and proud at once, as we slowly approached and embraced each other. It was the most powerful ritual of my childhood that taught me about profound friendship, the importance of role models, male vulnerability, courage, creativity, and ultimately, grief. And oh, how I'm grieving. My family and I have, unfortunately, already gotten an incredible head start in that department with the sudden departure of one Andrew Michael Neiman, who was the only person who looked up to my father more than I did when we were very young. And not a single little boy in goddamn human history wouldn't have. He was the most playful, hilarious, musical, ridiculous, loving father in the whole world. When he would tuck us in at night, he would kiss us on the forehead and tell us how special we were, and that we could do absolutely anything. That one may have fucked us up a little bit, actually. And while Bennett Alan Neiman was light years from perfect, he always made me feel like he was proud of me. And you know, I feel like maybe I never told him enough how proud I am of him. It just so happens that my beautiful new wife, Amanda, and I started trying to conceive only in the last month or so, at the exact same time of Dad's sharp decline. After 47 years, I'm going to become a father just after I've lost my own. God has a very good sense of humor. Or he's a dick. Or a poet. Because, Dad, you are the hero of this story. The amount of precious fatherhood gifts you have given me could fill the Taj Mahal. And without question, my child's heart. So from the bottom of my own, thank you so much for all of it. I'm the luckiest woman in the world.
I have an announcement. Bennett requested the following song, so Amanda and Diana are going to close us out.
And now the end
sure Bennett wouldn't have been out in the parking lot in 5 minutes. Here.
Nope.
There's so many more stories we can share, which is what Shiva is for. Thank you all for coming. There's so many more stories to share, but at Shiva will be the perfect time to do that.